All right.
Okay, you ready for me to start?
Yes.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah, thank you, Manoj, for having me. I'm looking forward to having you speak at the Dallas Salesforce Developer Group next month, or actually, yeah, still next month.
Yeah,
so it's still January. So thank you very much for having me. So sharing a pattern that was kind of a group effort, crowdsourced almost, that picked up on and I've tried to polish, and it's helped a bunch of people use flows for more than what they'd initially thought flows could be used for. So I'm excited to share that with people. And I love hearing feedback when people are hitting it. So please ping me either on Twitter or LinkedIn if you're trying to implement this. Like I said, it's just really fun when people get this to work, and I look for the next record-setting implementation of it. I think I've seen 1.3 million records processed by one flow with this pattern so far. So far that's the limit. I don't know if I want to get too much further in that and get myself in trouble with the governor limits people. But this is me. I run the Dallas Salesforce Developer Group. I've been running that for the past 2 or 3 years. Before that, I did a lot with SharePoint. I won the App Venture contest where I managed to shoehorn some Google Maps JavaScript code into Salesforce and kind of menuify the Salesforce interface and let people navigate Salesforce data with a map with Maps functionality. So have spoken at Dreamforce 3 times now. I actually got to go in person this year for the really small one. I'm UX Master certified from Nielsen Norman Group. That's one of my big passions is studying, not making apps better is great. Making apps better for people is best. So it's always fun to study the psychology of web design and peering more into the people side of code than the code side or the technical side. So having a good balance makes for better applications, and nobody wants to build an application that nobody wants to use. So it doesn't matter how many cool things it does. If nobody uses it, why? So you can reach out. Please grab me on Twitter. You find me on LinkedIn. I usually follow people back that catch me right after a session like this. So if you're wanting to reach out and talk about this afterwards, please do so. All right, so you're used to the safe harbor slide from Salesforce employees. I'm not a Salesforce employee. I'm an architect at Accenture, but these are my own opinions, not that of my company. And so here's the second warning. So this pattern is going to show you how to possibly make infinite loops, flows that don't stop running. I have not been given a call by anybody's success manager or support team yet, and I don't want to. So please be very careful when you're building these out. At the very end, I'm going to talk through the concept. The very end is about how to make a manageable and a safe version of these this pattern. So please make sure you pay attention and to that last part. That is the important part. And if you don't and you break your org, just remember you do not know me. Please don't say my name to such and so told me from how to write infinite loops and bypass governor limits. So we're not actually cheating. This is just a working pattern. And if you do it right, this makes flows really powerful, which I believe the intention is for Salesforce to continue to be able to do this. We've just got to be smart so they don't turn it off. All right, so the scope of the problem, what we usually do with flows. Something starts our flow. It runs on a certain date or time, or a record changes, or somebody clicks a button and starts it. We inevitably loop over some records. It doesn't have to. Your flows don't have to do that, but a lot of the repetitive ones, the ones that we're going to talk about here, when we loop over records, there are limits built into flows. There are governor limits about how long a transaction can be. There's other limits on how many iterations or activities you can do inside of a flow. So hopefully a lot of you have hit those, because this is who this presentation is really for. So we loop over our records, and then we hit these couple of different types of governor limits. Now, if your flow takes too long, you've got too many actions, or you're updating an object that has triggers attached to it, and those triggers take too long, or you're firing too many triggers and they don't get finished by the time you the flow finishes running, then you can hit a CPU time limit. So the time limit, I think, is still 10 minutes. If a transaction runs for longer than 10 minutes, it gets killed. I may need to go look that up. That may have changed since I started putting this together. Then there's an iteration count. So the iteration count is when you talk about complex flows, anytime you talk about looping, the thing that keeps flows from being too complex is you can only have 2,000 activities executed during any run of a flow. So if your flow has 2,000 steps in it, then it's fine. If it has 2,001 steps, it won't run, it won't finish, and it'll fail. If it has a loop in it that loops over 5 steps 1,000 times for 1,000 records, that's 5,000 iterations. That will stop at the 2001st iteration. So there's an element count inside of flows that you have to also play under. And then a lot of people love to use, so when they hit the CPU memory time, CPU time, the first thing somebody tells them, well, yeah, if it's running for 10 minutes continuously, if you pause it, you can get away from that time limit. But almost immediately after I see somebody get recommended to use pause, there's a problem. So if you're dealing with a large number of records, if you're dealing with a 50,000, 5,000 record set, all of that memory goes into the flows running heap memory. And if you hit pause, you have to save that. Salesforce saves that memory so that it can resume it at a later time. It's not currently processing it, it puts it aside and tries to save it for later. But anything that has a lot of records also has a lot of memory. So when people try to use pause, they almost immediately run into the... Hey, Kushagra, do you have a question?
Hey, if you're not talking, just go on mute, please.
Can you mute for all?
Yeah, I'll do that. Hold on.
All right, so yeah, as soon as you hit pause, it tries to save to memory. And so a flow large enough to run into CPU time almost always runs into a memory size element after that. Now, you can do subflows, and those don't get you out of memory, and they also don't get you out of CPU, and they also don't get you out of iterations. So you're still part of a transaction. So subflows are good for isolating and compartmentalizing stuff, but if you have too many elements in your flow, you still hit those same problems. So that's what we're here to talk about today. So if you've hit these or you've run into these are patterns that just don't work very well, and there's no really good workaround until now. All right, so hopefully there's 2 different types of people, or at least usually 2 different types of people on here. I run this presentation kind of weird. If you've already hit this, I'm going to show you what the final solution is conceptually before I show why and how to build it. So hopefully, if you've used flows a lot, if you've run into these problems, if you're experienced, you may get done with this within the first 5 minutes. So you'll be able to process it and have good questions. Then after that, I'm going to talk about all the steps that lead up to it, because you've got to have some pretty good kind of dev mindset to be able to make use of this. So if you do, here comes the big secret sauce. But so if you don't understand this at first, I'll explain it in the rest of the presentation. All right, so again, our basic flow. Something starts our flow, we go get our records, we loop over records, we build an update collection, and then we update records, and that's it. Now, where this has hit me personally before, I've had to throw away flows. I've written a couple of flows for clients. And because we know the iteration count is 2000, that means if I'm looping over something, if I'm building any kind of batch tool, and my example that I use, real example is there's a set of salespeople that work for a company selling a product, and the business wanted every month for every account and to every account owner to have a case created for them at the beginning of the month for each of their accounts to make contact with that account. So on the first day of the month at midnight, I would run my flow, and they said, yep, Paul, we only have 700 accounts, active accounts for this process to work. So I go into dev, I build this flow, it creates cases for all of the users, it loops over all my test data, I put it into production, and on number one that it's supposed to run, it fails. And the admin sends me the error message and says too many records, too many iterations. Like, well, it was only 700. That shouldn't be too many iterations. Oh, well, we have 700 accounts that are active. We actually have 3,000 total accounts in our org. Oh, well, I can't create a flow to loop over 3,000 records. I guess I'll have to write Apex. So all of that work I'd done on that flow had to be thrown away because I got the wrong number from the client. Sorry, my cat wants in her window. So I had to basically restart and throw away all of that work. Had another thing, had that happen a couple of times. And then the second time I tried making multiple copies of the flow, and I'd scheduled them to run within 10 minutes of each other. And there were so many steps in them, I ended up with 11 duplicate copies, or hopefully duplicate copies of the flow that were each scheduled to run 5 minutes after each other. And every time I wanted to make a change to the flow, I had to go in and edit 11 different copies at the end of the day, which not easy to maintain, not a good pattern, and it was kind of messy. You can't do that sustainably, but some of that pattern helped build this. So this is our basic flow. Now, what we're talking about cheating here, instead of doing multiple copies of the flow, which they all live, and this is the important part, a flow, the update of the records, and any of the triggers or anything that have to run after this all live in the same transaction. That transaction and the iterations in the flow are the limits that we're trying to work within. So what we're doing, the cheat that I came up with, or that we came up with, so we have something start our flow. And the first thing we have our flow do is create an event. An event is a special kind of object. It's written on the event bus, which is made to be kind of a pub sub model. It's a different data bus built into Salesforce that they added fairly recently. If you've heard of Kafka, it's kind of Kafka in platform. So when you write to events, an event, this that starts our flow, that creates an event, and then you have the ability to create an event triggered flow. Those events do not maintain a transaction. You're basically sending something out, and Salesforce stops monitoring the transaction so that anything that the event does starts its own transaction. So what we do is something starts our flow, and it's basically one step. Then we have an event triggered flow, which is just like a record triggered flow. It gets all of our records and non-tagged records. It gets the records that we're interested in. So this would be my 3,000 accounts. It would get all those 3,000 accounts. It loops over those 3,000 records. It's building up a collection of cases. It's also building up a collection of records that have been looped over. And then it's counting the number of times it goes through the loop. You set a limit on the loop. So I've got 3,000 records that come in here, but if I set a maximum of 400 loops and I break out of the loop at 400, I don't hit my 2,000 iteration limit. I grab those, I stop at 200 or 400. I create my 400 cases. If I've hit the max, I say, well, there's probably more records. I hit the max, so I know there's more records. So I'm going to update the records. I'm going to tag the records, and then I'm going to write another event. The same event that starts the flow over again. I hit the flow starts again. I get all the records except for the ones that I just tagged. If I wrote Monday or January, and all the records previously said December, this first run of the flow would tag those. Just all the records say December. The first 400 would now have January, and then the next time I ran the flow, I wouldn't be getting the January records. I would getting everything that was not January. So I'd have 3,000 minus 400. So those 2,600 records, I do another 400 of them, tag them, and write another event. Now there's only 2,200. So this flow just continues to work its way through your data byte by byte, and there's a lot of math that goes in here and data math that goes into properly sizing this, but I can pick up records, mark the ones that I've completed, that I processed, and then start the process over again. This same flow spins itself up again, runs, same flow, same logic, until it gets done. And if it doesn't hit the max loop, if it hits the end of loop, which is after last record, then you save everything, but you just don't create an event, and it stops. That's the secret sauce. And I can pause for any quick questions from advanced that want to ask it, but otherwise I'll step through how this works and how we can make this work for it. So it's really meant to not have to run into, if you don't know how many records you're going to have, if you don't know if this thing is expected to grow, this is how you build in a growth gate, if you will. And you can set, if you an admin alert of how many times you went through this flow, so that you know if it's growing, or if it's running off, or some of the logic's not working. So we'll talk about some other patterns to manage this. But really, it's just grab as many records as you think your flow can process them, mark those, and then get the next batch. So it's kind of batch gobbling up each of your records and using events to keep the same flow doing all the pieces. It's really the same thing as running the same flow over and over again. You're just using the platform event mechanism to reuse the same flow.
So just a question here. So for the platform event setup or whatever, all those required in order to make this happen, it's just the platform events, or are you going to do something outside like subscription model or something outside Salesforce?
As far as this pattern goes, the platform events are basically just objects and fields with a different setup. And I go through a setup of I've got some slides to show the setup of the platform events, but we're not doing it. Flows can listen for new events created on a bus, on the platform event bus, and they can create them. And they're created and listened to in exactly the same way that flows use objects. So as far as you're concerned, as far as a flow developer is concerned, events are just a different type of object that breaks the transaction process. The only thing you can't do with flows is query them. There's no way to go to dev console and query, hey, did my event get written? You need to have some kind of different debug patterns to build this, so we get to back in the end. But otherwise, it's just a different flavor of object.
Yeah, Paul, excellent one. Why did you say that? I mean, 1 million or 13 million, the number you said. I think it can do. I mean, 2 billion records. I mean,
yeah, it can run infinitely. In theory, it's infinite. I don't know if there's a governor of governor limits out there. So this flow is going to continue to call itself. So there's nothing published that says how this wouldn't work, but I suspect that there's some runaway process management that might eventually get called. Hey, if this flow has never not been in a running state for 3 hours, that it might be out there. But yes, theoretically, this is unlimited.
Excellent.
I have one question. How do you debug flows? I know there is like debug button, but sometimes it's not very helpful. And in comparing to Apex debugging, when at least we can read logs and we can find some culprit of the problem, in flows, sometimes it's very hard to debug, especially, for example, if you package flow into some managed package and some subscriber has some error. Did you ever had such a situation? How did you debug flow?
So this debugging these flows, these event pattern flows, is tricky because just like with record triggered flows, event triggered flows, you can't use debug. You have to have a system set up to create an event, and then that will run your flow. And then inside of flows, a lot of times I will build a debug object field. I'll build a log object, and I will write log data as I go through the flow to this log object record, and that way I can go read it. I'll also do like custom notifications to show me when branches hit, so I can or how many loops go through, so I can get 300 emails because it went through 300 times. But yeah, there's different. It's kind of alert or system.debug messages. You just have to start using that concept inside of flows. For packages, I could not begin to tell you. I've never tried to package up a flow into App Exchange or done any debug there, but I assume that you can create, your app can create its own custom object and start writing progress records to the log. And therefore build it up. I would just build up a variable as I was going through, and at each step, I'd add something to the variable, and at the end of the flow, I'd write the variable just so I could see how a bunch of math was done. I actually made that part of the application. I was building a scoring flow that would do a bunch of calculations on why this particular account got this particular grade, and being able to show the logic that was used is something that we'd love to see that will help us explain to the account why they got this score as opposed to just giving it to them. So I had to pretty it up a little bit, but my debug block and debug text field ended up being a feature of the application.
I see, thanks.
One question. I used a platform event from the Apex, like you create an object like platform event object, right? And you create some custom fields, and then you insert records into this platform event, and you write a trigger on the platform event that processes the records, right? That's what I used. So with the flows, when you say event trigger flow, right? So is it going to be the same? Like you have to insert the records into that platform event object that you create?
Have to insert records. Well, you're basically saying, so sort of. I mean, it's just writing a record to an object. You're saying run again, and the flow is listening to that object for any new records, and that record it doesn't even have to have any data in it. Though if the record shows up and it could say, widget, as long as this flow is waiting for any record, it's going to go out. The logic here has to do with tagging the records and saying, go get the records, but not the ones we already did. So the event comes along. Now if it's the only other thing you put in the event is which run group this is. So if I'm doing January's run and I know that I do it once a month, it should do all the records, and everything should not be January before January. So I make the assumption that all my records are December. And so as I come through, my event is telling the flow, today is this right here says start doing January. And this goes through and says, yep, do more Januaries. Do more Januaries. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't see that mouse there. Do more Januaries. Do more Januaries. Okay, there's no more Januaries. And then it stops. Next month, this says do February. And it goes through, does the same thing until it's changed all the January records to February. But really, I'll show you, it is really just creating a record inside of a flow, which is kind of almost the simplest component that flows have.
So in your pattern, you haven't created a separate platform event object, right? Let's say you are, so go ahead.
Yeah, no, I create a separate platform event object for you can do it for multiple flows, and I'll show you that's kind of the pattern I used. But I think I've had people argue with me, and I think I agree with them that I create one platform event object for each flow.
Okay.
And so each process is listening for exactly one platform event. But I'll show you could have it. So I passed January, and I could say account case, and I could have the first step of this flow listening, is this for account case? And if it's not, it does nothing. And that's the pattern I actually used to begin with, is one flow, I call it a turnstile, one flow turnstile event object, and it's each flow triggered flow, or I'm sorry, event triggered flow. The first step it does is interrogate the data in the event and says, okay, is this event supposed to start me going? And so all the event triggered flows would wake up, ask that question, and go back to sleep. And I think that's a little messy. So I don't think technically it's logically any different than having different events. But just from a management perspective, I've kind of shifted to telling people to have one event for each flow.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, so the developer concepts we're going to use to approach this problem. Hopefully that covered everybody that has already seen it, or does that make sense? Anybody who's hit these CPU memory limits understand what we're running understand what we're running into? I may have missed something. This can be kind of hard to explain.
I think it's similar to a queuable. So you can queue another queuable from a queue, and like this concept was introduced since batchable was used just to enqueue a new job. But there was like a limit of 5 execution time for queuable in developer edition. But using your idea, I think there is no limitation for developer edition, correct? So you can have like almost infinite loop here.
I think so, yeah. To me, this is a recursive pattern. It's not technically, it is kind of calling itself, but it's repeatedly invoking itself. It's not the true method of developer recursion, but to me, this is a recursion pattern for flows. I still have records to process. There's still things that meet the limits, and I need to continue to go through, but it's not processing the data and finally passing it back up like a recursive pattern was. But that's how I think of it. It's recursion for flows. So developer concepts to approach it. Shaping the record size. So this is the hardest and most important one, and you may have to alter your objects in order to get this going. And I'm going to talk about some of these in a little bit of a not ideal pattern first. There are some better ways to do it than the way I'm showing it, but I'm just going to show it conceptually simple. And we can attack and talk about advanced patterns at the end. But so shaping the record size of run your flow, saving progress on incomplete runs, and then setting up and creating platform events. All right. So step 1, sizing your data. So plan your data sizes. You cannot do a get records element that does not selectively pull back less than 50,000 records. You have to, if you're querying a very large record set, then you have to pass it conditions that are indexed, and you'll have to learn what indexing means, or indexable, that pull back less than 50,000 records per query. So this is the SOCL query that you've got to manage. Like I said, we'll talk. One of the ways to get around this, you had that question, and I will answer that. But anyway, you've got to be able to say, okay, where date equals this, or where code equals this. If you've got 1 million accounts, you've got to understand how to segment your 1 million accounts into groups of 50,000 records based on fields or conditions within that map to fields that return less than 50,000 records at a time. You can't point any flow at a group of records that have more than 50,000. You may have to go out and create one of the tricks is creating formula field on create, or a rule, a trigger on create that captures the year and month that account was created. So if you've got 1 million records, but they were accumulated over 20 years, 1 million divided by 20 may get you under 50,000. I'm not great at doing math in my head while I'm speaking, but that's one of the types of ways you would do it. If it's across, if you've got 100,000 records, but they're across 50 states, you can select one state at a time. So one of the ways to get this working with large sets of records, so if you have 1 million records in your select, you might do a platform event that selects one record at a time, works with a subset of the records, and then starts and passes that back up to the front. So I might, instead of calling this event, if I've got 10 groups of 50,000 records, I put an outer recursion on the event loop, and then I put some logic in at the end that says, if this is the last of this month, of this year, of this state's records, then I don't need to start the same event. I need to start a new event for a different state. So I'm going to skip that. That's more advanced. So we'll talk through it. So under 50,000 records, you've got to be able to segment it. You've got to be able to go get less than 50,000 records. Then you've got to be under 2,000 iterations within your flow element. If your flow is only one event, if it's just do this math on this set of records, add 1 to it, just count the number of records. If it's 1 step, then you can do 2,000 records. If it's 2 steps, figure out what this number is and then write this record, then you can do 1,000 records. That's what this elements is. So your loops count against you for that iteration count multiplied by every record that you're processing. And that's why we've got to do a max to catch that before we hit that iteration record. You've got to understand your data so you can properly plan that max. So again, most parts of the flow, for the sake of simplicity, some elements of flows don't actually count as iterations. I believe decisions, most of the time, as far as I know, don't actually count as elements and iterations, but get records and assignments definitely do. I don't think the loop structure itself does, but any of the assignments or any other elements would. So if a transaction takes too long, you get CPU limit. So we've gone through this before at the beginning. So breaking this up, how we count and how we plan our flow, these elements, so this loop is the important part to keep track of. If we're processing bulk records, there will be a loop. We need to know how many records we're processing, and we multiply by 3, however many our record set is, and then we add 3 for these one-time actions that are executed outside of the flow. So 3 one-time iterations and 1 per record loop iterations. So that goes into our math. So hopefully that's clear. Hit me at the end if we don't understand how that works, because I don't like talking through, and I say this about 14 times on how to do the math here. I think that should be clear to everybody. I don't want to put everybody to sleep doing different versions of it. But here's some, if you've got 20, one-time actions and 20 single actions, you divide by 2,000, subtract 10, and you can only do 90 records per flow as that bottom step. So looking at these examples, you may have to put your max. If you get a really complicated flow that needs to go over a lot of records, you may be only doing 90 at a time. And why do 90? Why work so hard? I mean, if we've got a pattern that can be called infinite times, who cares? Let's just do one flow per record and write an event every time. Efficiency. Flow bundles individual record element rights or collection rights really well, and we want to make use of that optimization as much as we can. So we're cheating a little bit by calling it over and over again, but we want to honor the performance that's granted by packaging things into a bulkified flow action. We don't want to give up easy and just say, I'll just write, I'll do it 1 per account, and I'll just do 1 flow iteration per account, and I'll just keep looping until I'm done with the accounts. Try to do as many as you can to take advantage of all those efficiencies there.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you go to the previous slide? What if you put some like subflows? So, for example, if you put what is inside of the loop as a separate flow, would it help to increase the number of records that you can pass to the flow?
Nope. Well, it still counts as iterations, and it's still part of the same memory being executed by the flow. It's just considered additional steps in the flow. It doesn't process it as if it's a separate thing. It's still part of the same transaction, and the memory used there is all grouped to the calling flow.
So you mean if, for example, if you group three elements into one subflow, it would be still counted as 3 elements, not as 1?
Yes.
Okay.
It adds the count of the subflow elements. I am 98% sure on that. Because I can't. The reason I'm so excited about this pattern is because that is one of the places that people kept trying to figure out how to do more records or have more complex flows, and they've all failed. They weren't able to spread those out. It still counts those iterations as a in-process addition to the calling flow. Fair enough. Okay. All right. So counting, saving, and resuming. So again, max record size 50,000. Beware of indexes. So if you want to use this pattern, make sure you go out and understand what indexes are. Some of the ways I've gotten this to work for large record sets is required having some fields indexed. So Salesforce you have to open a case with Salesforce to have them add an index to a field, and that just means that a query can use an index field to process large record set. It is an index field makes the object prepared to be queried and filtered when it's a really large set of object records. That's a rough way of explaining how index plays here. So when we're tracking batches, we're trying to keep track of the records that we process. We set a maximum. We try and understand that maximum based on our guess of how many events we're going to have in it. So we write our flow. We hope that we know it can do some. We build our flow out. We're testing it, trying to test it one record at a time, one element at a time, and trying to keep track of the number of iterations that we're going to have inside of loops. You may have multiple loops, and you have to count all of those to get to your preferred maximum record count that you can process. So you have to spend some time sorting the records in your head and knowing how many you're going to pull in so that you can create a maximum that you won't exceed the number of iterations, that will always stay under the iteration count and keep the flow from getting killed by the iteration count limits. So build variables. We'll build a variable to hold the max number of loops we want to hit. And then you can even create a tracking variable to catch which run you're on. So we'll talk about that too. That's kind of a advanced pattern also. Another thing that I use when we actually implement these is putting the max loops in a custom label so that if for whatever reason your flows start timing out, that you can, without editing the flow, you can go to the custom label and say, okay, only go through 100 loops now. The triggers are taking too long that are attached to the updates I'm making. Hit 100. Okay, that still times out. Okay, 90. And you can do that without editing your flow, and you can let an admin tune your flow without editing it. So yep.
Paul, I have a question. I'm a total rookie, so it's probably a really stupid question.
No stupid questions.
Is there any way to not deal with all of this, or maybe deal with less of this pre-calculation and have your system tracking as you go and saying you're about to reach the limit, just quit the loop and quit everything and store where you were and start again?
No, that's exactly what we're doing. You are looping through. You can't know the time limit. You can know the iteration, you guess on the iteration. If you've got one loop, you count each loop and you know roughly where you're at, and that's where you set the limit. But stuff like CPU time, I don't think you can query CPU time and say start over. That's a good question. But this should get, if you're doing something like this and you're hitting something like a count, which has a lot of triggers on it, and you need to know CPU time because things outside of the flow's control are adding into the process, this might not be a great pattern to use. This is really good for isolated stuff where you're doing, the most of the action that's happening on the objects with this flow. If it's cases, there's hopefully not a whole lot of extra triggers on cases when you're creating these. And then when you're writing back to accounts, that you're not triggering a bunch of triggers based on your tracking fields being the only thing that's updated. So you want to reach out and kind of connect to people, say, hey, yeah, don't have this trigger run if the only thing that's changing is this counter field that I'm altering with this flow.
I see the error in what I was thinking. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, yeah. All right, so counting loops. So this right here, this is a const, my first pattern setting a constant of 500 iterations. That means we could do almost 4 steps inside of our loop. If we only process 500 records at a time, getting to 1 million records will take a long time with 500, but that's how we would get there, is eating the elephant one bite at a time. And then here on account, I've created a field called flow code key, and that's where I'm going to store January, February, what have you. So it's just adding an extra field, just like everything was normal. And that's where you would populate your batches. Now, this is my least favorite part of the flows. I'm building up a 500 record collection, and I'm updating 500 account records every time we go through and create my 500 cases. There are some advanced ways to do this. If you've got any kind of numeric indexable field, if you've got an exact date time, you can capture the last date time of the account that was created. And if you do your query ordering by the date the account was created, you can just store the date of the last processed account and say, get me any accounts that are greater than this date. Now you lose the traceability of saying which ones are processed, but you also reduce the kind of the CPU and IO crunch that you do by updating batches of all of your accounts every time you run this process. So if that doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. Just continue to stick with the batching mentality of, if in my 500 accounts that I'm creating cases for, I write back to each one of those accounts that I created cases done for January. And then I get the rest of the next 500 I get the rest of them. I do 500 more that had December, and then I mark those. All right, this is the fun and easy part. So do not let this intimidate you. Creating platform events, super easy, and there's nothing to it for this process. You find platform events in setup, just like you'd find the object manager. You create a new platform event. Here's my flow turnstile platform event. And then custom field and relationships, my flow code key is where I put January. So when my schedule triggers that first event, it says do it for January. And it creates an event that says January. My flow picks it up and starts working through all the account records until it runs out of ones that haven't been stamped with January. But this is how the view of a platform event. This is the object. These are the fields. The only trick that I need to call out that I keep forgetting, when you set this up, it's important to set this publish immediately. I've forgotten that a couple of times. Sometimes events will wait for a commit step by default. So if you don't set this event, there's another process that you can't really touch with flows to commit the event. So publish immediately. As soon as your flow says create an event, you want it to hit the event bus, and that flow would end after that step, and a new instance of it would be picked up. So creating an event is exactly the same as, looks the same. It's even called an object inside of Flow. This is a edit create record. This is a create records element inside of Flows, and all I've done is select my event object instead of my account object. So looks exactly the same. Can't tell the difference. There's only a couple places that you can see. If you see the API name, event objects have __ E as opposed to custom objects having __ C. All right, so to assemble everything together, we've talked about it. Something starts our flow, we write an event that triggers our worker flow to go through the steps. It loops over the records, creates a tagging object, builds the case object, whatever change we want to have happen. It counts, it checks to see, hey, have I hit my 500 record limit yet? I haven't. Well, then I'm going to keep going through. Once I do, I'm going to do my work of updating the cases, and then I'm also going to tag all the cases that I've already finished. And then I'm going to, if I hit the max, then I write another event and I start over. If I got to the end of it, I'm finished, I do nothing. So here's what that looks like for your two flows. It's one flow that has one job on whatever schedule, just creates an event, that's it. And then the other flow does all the work. This is the step where I'm checking to see, this is kind of advanced steps. So I check, hey, did somebody want to kill this flow and stop it from running? Is this the right flow if multiple flows are listening to the same object? So ignore that for now. But this is the get records object. It's getting all the records that haven't been tagged with January already. It runs through these steps. It creates my case object. Oh, sorry, I should hover over. Creates my case object. Let me go through and go to the next slide. I create my case record. I stuff the record into a collection. I increment the count of records. Am I at 500? Yes or no? If yes, then I create my cases. I update my accounts, and then I create my other event. If I didn't hit the record and I got all the way through the loop after last item, I create my cases, I update my records, and I don't do anything. So both of these paths, the finish loop and the hit the max, the only difference between those is that you add an extra event here, or an extra element that creates an event, which causes this whole thing to start itself over and run again. That
one quick question there, Paul.
Sure. Yeah.
So when you hit the limit, right? So you are creating the events again, right? In the end.
Mm-hmm.
So when you are creating the events, are you filtering the records that needs reprocess? Like, let's say you have 1,000 records, right? You process 500 because you hit the limit 500, right?
Yep.
And when you are creating the events in the end, are you going to create the events for the rest of the 500?
So what you do is so the first step, and I'll go ahead and open this up so you can see it. So here's flow number 1. Here it's creating the records, and it's saying create the records, and it's sending the flow code key. For this one, it's sending the date. So this is where it's sending January. It's saying start a batch run of this flow of my infinite flow processor and start it for January. Now we go to the next flow that calls it. The first thing this flow says, okay, I'm running for January. I want to get every account record that doesn't equal January. So when I get through the end of the flow, the last thing I do, the second to the last thing I do, is I update all the accounts. And as I've been going through here, for each count that I'm going through it, I set the flow code key on the account collection. So this record goes into a collection, the collection gets updated. And so every one of these records that was previously processed now says January. And so this query doesn't get anything that was January. It gets everything that's not January.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
If,
Cool.
Paul, excellent explanation. Would you please, I mean, tell us you talked about in case of iteration index, I mean, count, which you have as a field. You talked about that if we put some index field, then it is going to be done. Would you please explain that once again?
When you put some index field on the object?
Yeah. So I mean, in case I mean, if you are not willing to use the iteration count, and if you want to use that index field, you said that it's going to do much better. I mean, I could not understand that part. If you could, I mean, explain that once again.
We'll do. Oh, okay. I think you're talking about so right. What this process does is because I've got my max loop, and I'll show you I've got a formula max label. So I go out to a custom label called account flow loop max, and I'm getting, in theory, that's set to 500. So I have a constant in here that's also 500, but the better way to do this is to call a label and turn the label into a number and use that number as your limit. So when I get all my records, so let's just talk about having 5,000 records. If I've got 5,000 accounts and I can do them in blocks of 500. So I set my max hit is to use the max label, which is set to 500, which means this thing is going to loop 500 times. And when it hits 500 times, it's going to exit and write those 500 records, and then come back, start again, and get another 500 records. What if I set my max loop counter to 1? So I get 5,000 accounts, I loop 1 time, and I write the account and I start over. I never have to worry about iterations. I'm just doing 10 iterations. And then every time the flow runs, it updates 1 account. And right. That's the difference. The higher you can set your max loop, the more the bigger collections you're processing into one bulkified DML statement for the flow to run. Otherwise, the smaller it is, it's additional updates. So if my infinite processing flow is only doing 10, only running 10 times and only doing 10 inserts, that's not really heavy CPU usage. If I'm making this, every iteration of the flow does 1 DML statement and does 1 record, but we run it 5,000 times, that's inefficient compared to 4 runs with 500 records as opposed to 5,000 runs with 1 record. So you should always try and push that iteration count as high as the limit as you can get to, while still keeping underneath the, being able to successfully process it.
I have a question. Why do you suggest using a label instead of custom settings or custom metadata? What happens if someone translates a label to some value which is not integer, and this might break your flow without your even knowledge?
It's true, and I have an answer for that. Custom metadata versus custom label. To get the value of custom metadata, you have to do a query. If you do a query, that's another get records element. If you were trying to manage the maximum number of iterations, that's 1 fewer iteration counted against you. Custom metadata is a perfectly valid opportunity for this. You could sort it, and definitely in a higher pattern, you would do something like that. It would only be 1 additional DML query if you did it at the beginning for whatever that number is. But going for maximum efficiency and least number of queryable objects, it may in the back end actually be a query, but as far as the flow is concerned, it doesn't count as an element like a get records in custom metadata would. But yeah, perfect question. Absolutely ideal as an advanced pattern.
Yeah, I think custom metadata, custom settings queries are not counted as queries in Apex. Do they count in flows as queries? Okay, I didn't know that.
Again, 98% sure on that. I haven't gone through and checked it, but yeah, tweak on your own from here. Please let me know if you figure out something that works better for this pattern. And I'll tell you, so next steps on this. So it's working through the flow. So did that. And all right. So if you try to do debug on these flows, it doesn't work. Event triggered or record triggered flows won't let you do the built-in debug process. And I had one of my first pieces of feedback, the best feedback I've gotten, because my plan for debugging was this, but fortunately somebody smarter thought about it. So I put inside of my flow, I put little custom notification actions. So I would call out, and every time I hit some place in my flow that I wanted to know that I got in there, I would get a bell notification, or I'd send an email to myself. And so I started putting debug in here. Those are additional elements, which means while you're tuning your flow, you have different limits. Hopefully you're working on a subset of data anyway, but it's a mess and it was not very elegant, but that's one way to do it. My genius boss at Accenture watched a video of this and he said, you should do 3 flows. So his pattern was, okay, a schedule or whatever trigger creates an event. Another event triggered flow captures the event, but the only thing it does is call a subflow. The subflow, if you build this section of it, oh, and you can't see what I'm circling. If you said if first step was call a subflow, the subflow could be all of these steps in an auto-launched flow. An auto-launched flow, you can debug. So you could pass in the element that the subflow is passing in and call that as a auto-launched subflow, and you could debug the auto-launched subflow manually without having to do all of these steps. You can use the regular tool. So it becomes a 3-flow pattern. That's a little confusing, but that to me is the ideal way to do this. And so every process would become a 3-flow pattern. So you trigger the event, capture the event, and call the subflow. Starts to get a little bit messy. You'll need good naming structure when you get there, but for speed of development, that's the way I would do it. It's because you get to make use of all of the debug elements that go with it, standard debugging tools for flow, and call it that way.
Yeah.
Otherwise, capturing events, you can't see them. There's no query for events to see if they got there. I almost always put something that fires after. I put a test in here that says send me an email if an event got fired as step 1. And once I get that working, I trust it, and then I start debugging and building the flow logic. So go ahead.
Notifications are not, counting as a, any state as it is. If we follow your pattern instead of the three flow pattern, if we follow this pattern and you are putting the notifications for the debugging, so it's not getting count against the the step, the step count, right? The notifications.
Yeah, the notifications absolutely count as an iteration. Adding, so everything that's outside of the loop almost doesn't matter. I usually leave myself about 100 elements because they only execute once. Right here, this is now a 4 iteration loop, and that definitely does. So as long as I'm not trying to debug here, I can leave those in. But again, you have to take them out, rewire your flow, and that can be exhaustive whenever the debug function inside of flows is superb. And especially if you're building.
Then your boss is said the correct one. That's much better. You get the Salesforce debugging, platform debugging facilities with the flow if you launch it with the auto launch flow. I think that's the better.
Yeah,
thing.
no, he's given genius comments. So it made it a little bit harder to explain if you're talking to people that have only just gotten into flows. Having a flow that calls a flow that calls a flow is getting kind of ridiculous. But if you've made it this far and don't have any questions, then yeah, that's the advanced pattern. The last piece to go over before we hit questions. So even if we only did one record, you can have, if we did one account at a time, you can do an outer loop. So if I know that I've got more than 50,000 records, I can break my setting up. I can add another set of logic here that says create an event. Okay, I got done. I'm still working. I didn't hit my maximum. Here I hit my maximum. If I hit my maximum and I'm working through state Texas, then create another event that says state equals Oklahoma. And then it would go through, loop through all of Oklahoma, continue. The event would pass Oklahoma into the flow, and Oklahoma January would be you'd only write January, but the flow event is passing Oklahoma January. So I'm querying Oklahoma and not January. And then I work through all of those. So that's when you can get beyond 50,000 records. You can also query, have outer flows that are running this, where you have one loop that creates an event for every single account, and it doesn't start to go to the next account and roll up all of the opportunity records, opportunity line items per account until it pushes through each one of the accounts. So it's hopefully everybody who's got a hold of this can see how you could create just a little bit logic and add a different variable in. And when we did the outer loop that did the 1.3 million records, the flow looked exactly the same, except for one other line on get records and a decision and an event at the end here on the I've just finished records. So millions of records versus thousands of records with only 2 changes in the logic of the flow. And I have never gotten hair stood up on it, got goosebumps watching this thing push through 1.3 million records just with that.
Excellent, Paul. So, Paul, if I understood it correctly, then you said that from Texas to January, and you talked about Oklahoma January. So you are keeping it the labels here, which are important. So you are keeping the labels. January in Texas, all the record processed. Then it is again the January in Oklahoma, all the record processed, and then going. So is there any second label is coming into the picture, or you are doing it with the same label here?
Doing it in the same, I think I understand. So this flow right here stays, this branch of the logic, when you hit the max flow or the max loop counter. So if I'm going through the states and I'm on the first state, I'm on Alabama or Alaska. So I'm going to keep using Oklahoma and Texas. So I go through and I'm going to keep hitting this. It's going to say, I start off with Oklahoma. If I've only got 2 states, I've got 10,000, I've got 100,000 records and they're divided across 2 states. I've looked at my data. I found a partition that says half of my records, less than 50,000, are in Texas, and the other half of the records are in Oklahoma. That's a good partition as long as Texas and Oklahoma are indexed. I can go query a 100,000 record object. I can get 50,000 records back. I get those 50,000 records. The flow says, go get, start a flow for January and start with Oklahoma. That's what this trigger does. It's going to send January, Oklahoma. The query, let me go here. The query is going to say, just like this one, go where it doesn't equal January, but you would say state equals flow code. Yeah. State equals Oklahoma. So we do that. And so that would query, that would get my first 50,000 records. I would continue to go through and say Oklahoma January. This right here, this is the looper. This right here is what makes everything start over. Oklahoma January, Oklahoma January, Oklahoma January. We'd hit the end and it would say, finally, there's only 30 records left, so it doesn't hit 500. It hits here and it goes, yep, I'm going to write all of the Oklahoma January cases. I'm going to update the Oklahoma January accounts. And then I would say, am I still is the flow code key Oklahoma? If it is, oh, well, I'm done with Oklahoma. Write an event that says Texas January. Then
Fantastic.
Texas January goes through, Texas January, Texas January, Texas January, hits this one. If it's not equal to Oklahoma, so I don't care anymore. And so it just dies. And so that's how I've done 100,000 records.
Fantastic. So we just need to put another condition with the same thing. So we are making more selective in that scenario if we are having that kind of data set. Fantastic. Yep. Excellent. Excellent, Paul. Thank you.
You're welcome. So yeah, we did some advanced stuff. Please, if you've got basic questions, a lot of this is hardcore digging into how flow works, and I'm hope I'm teaching that as well as how to possibly get yourself in trouble with infinite loops. When I first published this, and I showed my screenshots, I hadn't run. You can't get 1 million records inside a Trailhead, so I've never gone through and been able to test this. And I had this statement the wrong way. And somebody who'd copied this reached out for help, and we set up an infinite loop and had to go through the very panicked ways to kill an infinite flow from running infinitely. And I got to watch their org slow down. So that was scary. So don't do that, and make sure you're paying attention. And if you don't understand anything, please ask me now. All of this is fun flow stuff and harnessing the power of flows.
So how did you kill the infinite loop, Paul?
I had to deactivate the flow, kill all of the versions, and I ended up deleting the platform event as well.
Okay.
I think I renamed them at the same time so it wouldn't have the same name, but yeah, it was a bit of a panic. So from now on, I create step 1 is custom label equal to abort, and if it were not equal to abort, if it's anything besides, it'll go through, but if it equals abort or doesn't equal go, then the flow dies and stops. So I can just go catch that, and the next flow instance that would run would check that flow, get here, and there is no default event. It would just die on the strand and never get to launching another event. The other step that you would do is when you're creating your new event, also plan adding a run max. So if the first time I run this, I go get my custom label for run max, and then I do run max -1, and I pass that number 499 to the event. The event brings in 499. The next time it runs, it's 498. And then I'd add a step here that says, if current run is equal, if run max or run limit equals 0, then don't run. So you can say, this thing should never run more than 500 times. If it's doing 500 records at a time, if it gets to more than 250,000, something's gone wrong. Or 250 million. I'm really not great at math online, but that you can put in there. It's a really good idea when you're first putting this into production, especially if it's the first time you're going with massive data, that you loop it 5 times and then watch those 1,000 records get processed, and make sure that it stops, and then set it to, okay, I should probably, right now, it should only loop through 10 times to do all of my records. I'm going to set it to 20 to account for the next 5 years of growth, but eke it up. So run it up, you do 2 runs, make sure it stops, make sure it processes everything okay, and then 20, 10, 5, 10, and 20.
Where are you storing the run number?
All of those I would put in custom labels or in custom metadata.
Okay, so you can change the information on the custom label.
Yeah. So let me show.
Okay.
I have a question. How much time did it take to process 1 million of records?
1.3 million records we did in about 20 minutes.
20 minutes, cool. Because actually I had some task to process, to insert 50,000 users, and I tried first to use some Apex from LWC component. It was taking some like 8 hours, and I tried to use bulk API, and it would take in like 1 hour and 15 minutes. So did you consider using something like bulk API to process millions of records or something like that? Why your choice was to use Flow?
Well, so my use for, so I'm trying to solve some user editable business process problems, and I'm trying to use flows. So yeah, bulk API, I mean, there's definitely better ways to do bulk, but this is, if you're solving for things inside of a middle package, if you're doing millions and millions of records, yeah, you probably want to use bulk API. If you're pulling it from different systems, but the difference between being able to do 800 records in flows and when you would need to go to bulk API right now is 801. And that's, to me, stupid. This tool is powerful enough, and you can have some efficiencies and scale with your needs. If I set up a process that, hey, it's only for 10 users, but we acquire a company that has 10,000, I don't have to start over and write a new package and write a new process. If flows have worked for me, they can continue to scale. But yeah, you need to be smart about it. You need to, 1.3 million records, it may not be the right size for this. If the things that we're updating were heavily triggered in a complex environment, you're going to hit CPU limits, and you really don't want to do. You want to put your code in line with other code that's working there. If you've got a lot of code on accounts and you're adding, massive levels of accounts there, you've got to be smart about it. But this is moving flows from, hey, they can just do screen flows or 10 steps to, it can actually, if you've got a small business that doesn't want, if they've got 2,000 Salesforce licenses, or they're dealing with 1,000 accounts. One of the places I came up with is trying to grade orphanages in a state, and it was a small license purchase, and they weren't planning on hiring Apex developers or maintaining Apex code. This makes it to where you can keep that scale, you can expand the scale of flows. It's not right for everything. You definitely want to be smart about it. You don't want to break your org, and there's a definite possibility of causing problems for your org and your tenant. But it takes it past just that hobby thing. And so, oh yeah, we can't do anything with flows except for create screens and do little trigger update records, one line item. This means you don't have to throw away your code because you had added 10 more accounts or 30 more users, and that's what I got tired of. So that's what made me think of this. And it was a lot of people that are running into this when they hit that 1,001st record, they have to throw away their flow, and they would try to make their flow work with more records. Most people are trying to get to 5,000, 10,000. 50,000, which is a queryable number, is actually a really good number. Yes, we found a way around it by doing outer loops and partitioning it with indexes, but flows being able to process 50,000 records, I think, is a good number to think about and run. And if I had to make 5 flows to do 5 different queries without adding, loops within loops or additional code keys and loop over different segments, that doesn't hurt me for that, hurt my feelings for being able to do that many records. But you don't have to. There's a way around it. But that puts flows into a professional league, as opposed to me, it was kind of a screen tool. It was not an automation tool.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I fully agree with you. I mean, if somebody, is a small and they cannot hire a Apex developer or having a small org, then it's fully justified. Paul, this particular pattern for that matter. I fully agree with you on this.
Thanks.
Yeah, and you might need for bulk API, you might need other tools outside Salesforce to perform those kind of things, like ETL tools or something like that, which again adds cost and additional skill set. So yeah, there's another approach which is within Salesforce.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Thank you very much, Manoj.
One more question. Did you try to use streaming monitoring object change product which comes from Salesforce Labs? I think it's very helpful to get the subscribe to platform event and to see when they're firing. It has very good visible.
Yeah, there's a Comet D plugin that you can use inside of VS Code. But again, this is more. I'm trying to stay away from stuff that's really developer, classic developer centric, and more with app builder centric stuff. But can you post the link in the chat? I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, I have already posted it. We use it for some of our projects to keep watching and monitoring for platform events.
Oh, that's outstanding.
In the chat.
Yeah, but with great tools come great responsibility. I was more scared of being sued by Sony than Squid Games, or that would have been my my message. But yeah, is that the App Exchange thing that you've got that you published there? Open that up. Streaming monitor, outstanding. Thank you. That's fantastic. Yeah, I love it.
Thank you. Okay, I think, yeah, we're at the end of the session. So yeah, please feel free to ask questions, any other questions around the integration patterns or flows or anything which we can talk about. So Paul, you're gonna run some quiz. I think we're gonna take couple of winners from those quiz, and then we're gonna have a couple more winners using maybe the wheel of names. So we're gonna actually give away 4 certification vouchers, which each voucher value for $200 certification exam for Salesforce.
Great, I will do that. So yeah, first question is, what is the iteration limit for flows?
2000.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Have to type, or you have to.
Either ways, I see a lot of people are typing. Okay, so yeah. So we got a lot of people mentioned 2000. And Borden was the first to post in chat, so probably we'll have our first winner. Congratulations, Borden.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Borden.
Okay, the next question, yeah, you can type or you can talk. So probably type is the best way. So yeah, Paul, go ahead with the next question.
All right, and the maximum number of records that can be queried from a get records element.
50,000.
Okay, we got a 50,000 before you say by Nagesh on the chat. Okay, so yeah, we got another winner, Nagesh.
Thank you.
So you guys can reach me later, but let's continue. Let me take our screen and let me pause actually recording for a while.